Hey guys, welcome back. There's been a lot going on lately around the Duggar family, and honestly, this situation feels very different from the usual headlines people are used to seeing. This time, it's not just rumors floating around or outside commentary. It's coming from people who are directly connected to Joseph Duggar, and they're choosing to speak up in their own way. What makes this even more noticeable is how they're doing it. Instead of going to major media outlets or giving interviews, they've started sharing things themselves on their own platforms in their own words. And that shift alone says a lot about how serious things have become. So here's where things start to get complicated. Joseph Duggar, who for years stayed relatively quiet compared to some of his siblings, is now at the center of growing criticism. And it's not coming from strangers, it's coming from his in-laws. They've made it clear, without directly saying everything outright, that something has gone very wrong behind the scenes. One of the first signs people picked up on was a family photo they shared publicly. At first glance, it looked like a normal update, but when you really looked at it, the absence was obvious. Kendra wasn't there, their children weren't there, and Joseph wasn't there either. That kind of silence, especially in a family that used to present unity above everything else, doesn't happen by accident. Not long after that, things escalated in a way that made people start paying even closer attention. A GoFundMe was set up by Kendra's family, and the reason behind it wasn't something minor or temporary. They explained that they needed financial help to find safe housing and leave the place they were currently living. What makes that detail stand out is the fact that the home they were trying to leave was connected to their own daughter and son-in-law. When a family is asking for help to get away from a situation tied directly to their own child's household, it raises questions that go far beyond a simple disagreement or family tension. At the same time all of this was unfolding, another voice added fuel to the situation. Amy King, who is related to the Duggars but has often spoken out against them, shared her own statements online. She had reportedly traveled to Arkansas to support Kendra's family in person, helping them pack and just being there during what sounds like an incredibly difficult time. What makes Amy's involvement even more significant is that she's dealing with a situation in her own life that she says mirrors what's happening here. According to her, her own son-in-law, someone connected within the same broader circle, is facing similar kinds of serious allegations. And in both cases, she claims there's a pattern: men who are accused of harmful actions while also influencing or controlling the narrative within their own households. As soon as Amy started speaking out, the situation didn't stay quiet for long. Reports began circulating, and suddenly there was a surge of media interest. Journalists and outlets started reaching out, trying to get statements, trying to piece together what exactly was happening. But here's where things take another turn, because instead of engaging with that media attention, the people involved have largely chosen not to participate in it at all. And that decision isn't random. It comes from a deep distrust that's been built over years. From their perspective, the same media that is now asking questions is the same media that once helped build the Duggar family's public image in the first place. It's the same system that amplified their influence, protected their reputation, and in some cases, downplayed or reframed serious issues when they first surfaced. There's a belief among those now speaking out that those platforms were used strategically in the past to shape narratives, to protect certain individuals, and even to cast doubt on people who tried to come forward. So instead of going through those channels again, they've chosen something different. They're speaking directly, controlling their own message, and avoiding anything that could be twisted or filtered through the same outlets they no longer trust. That decision becomes even more powerful when you look at the statement Kendra's family eventually released. They described themselves as heartbroken and deeply troubled by the alleged actions connected to their son-in-law. But what stood out the most wasn't just their concern for their own family, it was their focus on a young victim. They spoke about a child who had the courage to come forward and share her story, and they made it clear that their support is fully behind her. They emphasized the importance of believing
victims, of allowing them to speak without fear, and of trusting the legal process to bring the truth to light. It wasn't a defensive statement, it wasn't vague or dismissive, it was direct, emotional, and centered around accountability. At the same time, they didn't ignore the impact this situation is having within their own family. They acknowledged the trauma affecting their grandchildren and expressed ongoing love for their daughter, even while everything around them feels unstable. That balance, supporting a victim while also navigating the emotional weight within their own family, is part of what makes this situation feel so complex. It's not a clean, simple story. It's layered, and every layer adds more tension. And when you zoom out a bit, this situation doesn't exist in isolation. It connects back to a much bigger picture, one that involves years of influence, control, and a very specific belief system that shaped not just the Duggar family, but the people around them. There's been growing criticism over time about how that system operates, especially when it comes to power dynamics, the role of women, and the pressure placed on young people within those environments. What we're seeing now feels less like a sudden event and more like something that's been building quietly for years, finally starting to come into the open. The part that's hardest for a lot of people to process is how different this looks compared to the image that was once promoted so heavily. For a long time, the Duggars were presented as an example, something to admire, something to follow. But situations like this force people to reevaluate that image and question what was happening behind the scenes the entire time. And when those questions start coming not just from outsiders, but from within the family itself, it changes how everything is viewed. Right now, what's unfolding isn't just about one person or one allegation. It's about a shift in control over the narrative. It's about people who were once silent choosing to speak, even if it's in a limited or careful way. And it's about a system that's being examined more closely than ever before, not through filtered interviews or controlled messaging, but through real-time actions and statements that are harder to ignore.
As more people started paying attention to what was happening, the conversation slowly shifted from just the current situation to the bigger system surrounding it. Because the truth is, none of this exists in isolation. The Duggar family didn't just become influential on their own. They were elevated, promoted, and in many ways protected by platforms that turned them into a household name. And when something is built that carefully, it doesn't just disappear overnight. It leaves behind patterns, expectations, and in some cases, damage that takes years to fully understand. One of the things that keeps coming up in discussions around this is control: who has it, how it's used, and how deeply it's embedded into everyday life within that environment. For years, the Duggar family was associated with a very strict belief system, one that emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and clearly defined roles within the household. On the surface, it was often framed as structure or discipline, something positive and faith-driven. But when you look at it through the lens of what's being revealed now, it starts to feel a lot more restrictive, especially for the younger members of the family. There's been increasing scrutiny over how relationships were formed within that circle, particularly when it comes to marriage. The idea of courtship was always presented as something intentional and pure, a way to build strong, lasting relationships with guidance from parents. But in practice, it often looked less like guidance and more like control. Decisions weren't always made independently, and in many cases, the involvement of parents went far beyond simple advice. It shaped who people met, how they interacted, and ultimately who they ended up marrying. When you connect that to what's being said now, especially by people close to the situation, it raises difficult questions about how much choice was actually involved. Kendra, for example, grew up around the Duggar family, which meant she was already familiar with their lifestyle long before any relationship was officially established. In environments like that, where certain families hold a higher level of influence or status, it can create a kind of pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, that makes certain outcomes feel almost expected. And when expectations are set that early, it becomes harder to separate personal choice from external influence.
Another layer to this is the way authority is structured. Jim Bob Duggar, as the head of the family, has long been seen as the central decision maker, not just for his own household, but in many of the relationships connected to it. Over time, stories and claims have circulated suggesting that his influence extended into arranging, or at least heavily guiding, marriages for his children. While not every detail is confirmed publicly, the consistency of these claims have kept the conversation going, especially now that more people are willing to speak openly about their experiences. What makes this even more complicated is how normalized all of it seemed at the time. For viewers watching from the outside, it was presented as tradition, something rooted in faith and values. But for those inside or closely connected to it, the reality may have felt very different. There's a difference between choosing a lifestyle and being raised in one where alternatives aren't fully available or encouraged. And that distinction matters a lot when trying to understand situations like the one unfolding now. At the same time, there's also been growing attention on how information was managed. The Duggar family was known for being very careful about what they shared publicly. Interviews were controlled, appearances were structured, and messaging was consistent. That kind of control can be effective in maintaining a certain image, but it also means that when something breaks through that control, it often reveals much more than expected. The current situation feels like one of those moments where the usual structure isn't holding the way it used to. Another important factor is the role of media and how it contributed to all of this. For years, networks and outlets didn't just report on the Duggar family, they helped shape how they were perceived. Shows were produced, stories were highlighted, and certain narratives were reinforced again and again. That kind of exposure doesn't just bring attention, it brings influence. It creates opportunities, connections, and in some cases, power that extends beyond what viewers might realize. Now, with everything that's coming out, there's a growing sense that some of that influence may have played a role in how situations were handled or even overlooked. When a family gets that well known, it can change how people around them respond. It can create hesitation, doubt, or even silence in moments where speaking up would have been difficult to begin with. And when you combine that with a controlled internal structure, it creates an environment where issues can remain hidden longer than they should. At the center of all of this are the people directly affected, especially those who are now being referenced in statements and discussions. The mention of a young victim in Kendra's family statement brought a level of seriousness to the situation that can't be ignored. It shifted the focus away from speculation and towards accountability, making it clear that this isn't just about family conflict or public image, it's about something much more serious. And that's where the tone of everything changes, because once that kind of detail enters the conversation, it's no longer just about analyzing behavior or questioning systems. It becomes about responsibility, about who knew what, and about how situations like this are handled when they come to light. The way Kendra's family chose to respond, by publicly supporting the victim and encouraging others to speak out, signals a clear break from the kind of silence that people often associate with environments like this. At the same time, it also highlights the risk involved in speaking up. When families are this interconnected and influence runs this deep, going public with concerns isn't a simple decision. It can lead to backlash, isolation, or pressure from multiple directions. And yet, despite all of that, they still chose to take that step, even if it was in a controlled and measured way. All of this leaves people trying to piece together what's really happening behind the scenes, not just in terms of specific events, but in terms of the larger system that allowed things to reach this point. Because situations like this don't develop overnight, they build over time, shaped by patterns, decisions, and environments that either prevent or allow accountability. And right now, it feels like those patterns are being examined more closely than ever before, not just by the public, but by people who were once part of that inner circle.
As more details continue to circulate, the focus is no longer just on what allegedly happened, but on how an entire environment may have allowed situations like this to exist without being challenged sooner. Because when you look at everything together,
The structure of authority, the control over relationships, the management of public image, it starts to paint a picture of a system where accountability isn't always straightforward. And that's exactly why moments like this feel so significant. They interrupt that system. One of the most difficult things to unpack here is the idea of influence inside families that operate this way. When authority is centralized and reinforced over years, it doesn't just affect decisions, it shapes how people think, how they interpret situations, and even how they respond when something feels wrong. In some cases, people may not even recognize certain behaviors as harmful right away because they've been conditioned to trust the structure around them. And when that structure is tied to faith, community, and identity, questioning it becomes even harder. That's why the response from Kendra's family stands out so much. It's not just what they said, it's the fact that they said anything at all, and how directly they addressed the situation. Supporting a victim publicly, especially in a situation tied to someone within your own family, goes against the pattern that many people have come to expect from environments like this. It signals a shift, even if it's a small one, toward prioritizing truth over image. At the same time, it also highlights just how complicated these situations can become on a personal level, because this isn't just about public statements or legal processes. It's about real relationships. It's about parents, children, spouses, and extended families who are now navigating something that affects all of them in different ways. There's support, there's conflict, and there's likely a lot happening behind closed doors that isn't visible to the public at all. Another layer that keeps coming up is the idea of isolation. Over the years, there have been ongoing discussions about how families within these circles often remain closely connected to like-minded communities, sometimes limiting outside influence. That kind of environment can make it harder for alternative perspectives to break through, especially when everything from education to social interactions is shaped within the same framework. And when issues arise, that isolation can make it even harder for people to reach out or seek help. What's happening now challenges that dynamic in a very visible way. By speaking publicly, even in a limited capacity, Kendra's family has stepped outside of that usual pattern. They've opened the door for conversations that might not have happened otherwise. And in doing so, they've also created space for others who may be in similar situations to feel less alone. Their message wasn't just directed at one person, it was directed at anyone who has experienced something similar and may be struggling to speak up. There's also a growing awareness around how narratives are shaped after situations like this come to light. In the past, there have been instances where stories were reframed, minimized, or redirected in ways that protected certain individuals while casting doubt on others. That's part of why controlling the narrative has become such an important factor here. By choosing to speak on their own terms, rather than through traditional media, those involved are trying to avoid that kind of distortion. And it's not just about avoiding misrepresentation, it's about trust. When people feel like their voices haven't been accurately represented in the past, they're less likely to rely on the same channels again. That shift toward independent communication, whether through social media or direct statements, reflects a broader change in how people handle sensitive situations like this. It's more immediate, more personal, and in many ways harder to control from the outside. Meanwhile, the broader public reaction has been a mix of concern, skepticism, and reflection. For some, this situation confirms long-standing doubts about the Duggar family and the system they represent. For others, it's a moment of re-evaluation, especially for those who once viewed the family as an example of something positive. When a narrative that's been consistent for so long starts to crack, it forces people to reconsider what they thought they understood. And then there's the question of accountability, not just for individuals, but for the systems and platforms that played a role in elevating all of this in the first place. The Duggar family didn't operate in isolation from the public. Their visibility was amplified, their lifestyle was showcased, and their influence expanded through that exposure. Now that more difficult conversations are happening, it's inevitable that attention also turns toward the role those platforms played in shaping public perception. Because visibility comes with responsibility. When a family is presented as a model to millions of viewers, it creates a level of trust, and when that trust is later challenged, it raises questions about how much was known, what was overlooked, and whether things could have been handled differently at earlier stages. These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers, but they're becoming harder to ignore. At the center of everything, though, are the people directly affected by what's been described. The mention of a young victim continues to be the most serious and grounding part of this entire situation. It shifts the focus away from speculation and back to what actually matters, ensuring that those who have been harmed are heard, supported, and protected. Everything else, from public image to family dynamics, becomes secondary when viewed through that lens. What's unfolding now feels like a turning point, not just for the individuals involved, but for how situations like this are addressed moving forward. There's a growing expectation that silence isn't an acceptable response anymore, that difficult truths need to be acknowledged, and that systems, no matter how established, should be questioned when something doesn't feel right. And while there's still a lot that remains unclear, one thing is certain: the conversation has changed. It's no longer just about what's being presented on the surface, it's about what's underneath it, and whether that reality is finally being brought into the open.
At this point, what's unfolding isn't just another moment of controversy that fades after a few news cycles. It feels like something that's forcing a deeper look at everything that led up to it: the environment, the influence, the decisions, and the silence that may have surrounded it for years. Because when people from within that circle begin to step forward, even carefully, it changes the weight of the conversation. It's no longer just outside criticism or speculation. It becomes something more grounded, more difficult to dismiss, and much harder to control. And the reality is, situations like this don't just impact one person or one family. They ripple outward, affecting everyone connected to it in different ways. There are relationships being tested, beliefs being questioned, and a lot of people trying to process something that doesn't fit the image they were shown for so long. For some, it's about understanding how things reached this point. For others, it's about recognizing patterns that may have been ignored or misunderstood before. And for many, it's about deciding what accountability should actually look like moving forward. There's also a growing sense that conversations like this are no longer staying contained within specific communities. They're reaching a wider audience, bringing attention to systems and structures that people may not have fully understood before. And that awareness matters because it creates space for more questions, more transparency, and hopefully more protection for those who might otherwise feel unheard. When people see others speaking up, even in difficult situations, it can shift the mindset from silence to action. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not everything is going to be clear right away. There are still details that haven't been publicly confirmed, perspectives that haven't been fully shared, and processes that take time to unfold. But even with that uncertainty, the tone of what's happening now feels different. It's less about maintaining appearances and more about confronting reality, even when that reality is uncomfortable. What stands out the most is the shift in who is being centered in this conversation. Instead of focusing only on reputation or public image, there's been a clear emphasis on supporting those who have been affected, especially the young victim mentioned in the statement. That shift changes everything because it moves the priority away from protecting a system and toward acknowledging harm and seeking truth. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to go back to the way things were before. This moment also raises a bigger question that goes beyond just one family or one situation. How many other stories exist that haven't been told yet, and how many people are still trying to find the courage to speak? Because if there's one thing that's become clear, it's that silence doesn't always mean everything is fine. Sometimes it just means no one felt safe enough to say anything. And now, with everything that's come out so far, it feels like that silence is starting to break, piece by piece. Not all at once, not in a perfectly clear way, but enough to start changing the conversation.
enough to make people pause, reconsider, and look a little closer at what's really been happening behind the scenes. So as this continues to develop, it's not just about waiting for more information, it's about paying attention to how things are being handled, who is being supported, and whether real accountability follows. Because in situations like this, what happens next matters just as much as what has already come to light. And if you've been following along and want to stay updated as more information comes out, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. You can also share your thoughts below, because conversations like this only grow when more people are willing to engage with them.